The morning sun cast long shadows across Windsor Castle as Prince William stood at the tall windows of his private study. His fingers traced the edge of a letter that had arrived just hours before, bearing news that would shake the very foundations of the royal family. The Queen's health had taken a sudden turn, and doctors were calling family members to gather at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. Catherine entered the room quietly, her footsteps barely audible on the ancient wooden floors. She had been preparing their children for school when the call came, but now everything had changed. The normal rhythm of their lives, breakfast with George, Charlotte, and Louis, the usual royal duties, the carefully planned public appearances, all of that seemed to fade into the background. "The children know something is different," Catherine said softly, moving to stand beside her husband. "George keeps asking why we're not going to school today, and Charlotte noticed that you've been on the phone with your father 3 times already." William turned from the window, his face showing the weight of what lay ahead. As second in line to the throne, he had always known this day would come, but knowing and experiencing were entirely different things. The royal family had weathered many storms over the decades, but losing the Queen would mark the end of an era that had defined Britain for over 70 years. The couple had built their relationship on honesty and mutual support, qualities that had helped them navigate the unique pressures of royal life. Catherine had learned to read the subtle signs of stress in her husband's expression, the way his jaw tightened when difficult news arrived, how his shoulders carried the invisible burden of duty and expectation. "We need to pack quickly," William said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "The plane is waiting at RAF Northolt. Harry is flying in from California, and Anne is already driving up from Gloucestershire." The logistics of gathering a body, scattered royal family in times of crisis always required military precision, something the monarchy had perfected over centuries of practice. Catherine nodded and moved toward their bedroom to gather essentials. She understood that this journey to Scotland might be the last time they would see the Queen as simply grandmother and family matriarch, rather than as a figure of historical significance. The children would need careful handling in the days ahead, requiring explanations that balance truth with age-appropriate understanding. As they prepared to leave, William found himself remembering countless moments with his grandmother, childhood visits to Balmoral, formal state occasions, private, family gatherings where the Queen's warmth and wisdom had guided him through the complexities of royal duty. She had been the steady constant in a family that had faced public scandals, personal tragedies, and the evolving expectations of a modern monarchy. The drive to the airport was unusually quiet, with their protection officers maintaining professional discretion while the couple processed the magnitude of what was unfolding. Catherine reached across the car's leather seats to take William's hand, a simple gesture that spoke volumes about their partnership and shared understanding of the responsibilities that lay ahead. At the airfield, the royal plane waited with engines already running. Other family members were making similar journeys from across the country and beyond, all converging on the Scottish Highlands, where the Queen had always found her greatest peace. The irony was not lost on William that Balmoral, the place where his grandmother felt most at home, would likely become the setting for the royal family's most profound goodbye. The flight to Scotland felt both endless and far too short. William stared out at the familiar landscape below, watching the English countryside give way to the rugged beauty of the Scottish Highlands. Beside him, Catherine worked quietly on, her phone coordinating with their household staff about the children's care and managing the delicate balance of royal duties that couldn't simply stop, even in family crisis. "The Prime Minister's office has been calling," Catherine mentioned quietly, showing him several missed calls and messages. "They're asking about arrangements, but I think it's too early for those conversations." Her diplomatic experience had taught her when to engage with official channels and when to protect the family's private moments. Landing at Aberdeen Airport, They were met by the Queen's personal staff, faces grave but professionally composed. The drive to Balmoral took them through some of Scotland's most breathtaking scenery, but neither William nor Catherine seemed to notice the heather-covered hills or the ancient stone bridges they passed. Their minds were focused entirely on what awaited them at the castle. Balmoral appeared through the trees like something from a fairy tale, its distinctive towers and turrets rising against the Scottish sky. This had always been the Queen's sanctuary, the place where she could shed some of the formality of monarchy and simply be a grandmother, a wife, a person who loved dogs and horses and long walks in the countryside. King Charles met them at the entrance, his face showing the strain of the past few hours. Father and son embraced briefly, a rare public display of affection that spoke to the gravity of the situation. "She's been asking for everyone," Charles said quietly. "The doctors say we should prepare ourselves, but she's still very much herself, still asking about the children and whether Harry's plane landed safely." Inside the castle, the atmosphere was unlike anything William and Catherine had experienced during their many previous visits. The usual cheerful bustle of royal life had been replaced by hushed conversations and careful footsteps. Staff members, who had served the Queen for decades, moved with practiced efficiency, but their eyes betrayed deep emotion. Princess Anne approached them in the corridor, her typically brisk demeanor softened by exhaustion and worry. "She's been holding court from her bed," Anne said with a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Still giving instructions about the Highland Games next month and asking if someone remembered to feed the corgis their afternoon treats. The Queen's bedroom was warm and filled with afternoon light streaming through tall windows that overlooked the gardens she had tended for so many years. Fresh flowers from those same gardens sat in vases around the room, their fragrance mixing with the familiar scents of lavender and old books that always seemed to follow the Queen wherever she went. When William and Catherine entered, the Queen's face lit up with genuine pleasure despite her obvious frailty. "There you are," she said, her voice still carrying that unmistakable authority mixed with warmth. "I was wondering if you'd remembered to bring pictures of the children. I do hope George is practicing his piano lessons and that Charlotte hasn't talked you out of her riding lessons again." Even in these circumstances, the Queen's first thoughts were for her great-grandchildren, for the continuation of family traditions and the small details that made up the fabric of their lives. William felt his throat tighten as he realized how typical this was of his grandmother, facing her own mortality while still worrying about everyone else's well-being. Catherine moved to sit beside the bed, taking the Queen's hand with the natural ease that had developed over their years of relationship. "They're all thinking of you," she said. "Louis drew you a picture of the horses at Sandringham, and George wanted me to tell you that he's been reading about the history of Balmoral for his school project." Evening settled over Balmoral with unusual stillness, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The royal family gathered in the Queen's sitting room, a space that had witnessed countless family meetings, celebrations, and quiet moments over the decades. Tonight, however, felt different from all those previous occasions. The weight of history hung in the air, along with the unspoken understanding that they were living through the end of an era. Harry had arrived from California looking travel-worn but determined, his relationship with the family still strained, but set aside for this moment. He sat quietly near the window, occasionally glancing toward his father and brother with expressions that mixed sadness with something that might have been regret. Meghan had remained in California with their children, a decision that had sparked brief discussion but was ultimately accepted given the complexities of their situation. The Queen insisted on joining them for dinner, despite the doctor's protests, appearing in the dining room wearing one of her favorite tartan skirts and a simple cardigan. Her pearl earrings caught the light from the chandelier as she took her customary place at the head of the table, maintaining the dignity and presence that had defined her reign even as her physical strength clearly waned. "I want to talk about what comes next," she said once the staff had served the soup course, her voice carrying across the table with quiet authority. "Not the official procedures. Those are all written down and practiced. I mean what comes next. For all of you as a family, as people who happen to carry titles and responsibilities that will outlive us all." Catherine watched as the family members around the table processed this direct approach to a subject that had always been understood, but rarely discussed so openly. The Queen had never been one to shy away from difficult conversations, but there was something particularly poignant about her willingness to address her own mortality with such frankness. William felt the familiar weight of his future responsibilities, settling more heavily on his shoulders. Soon, much sooner than anyone had hoped, he would move one step closer to the throne that had been his destiny since birth. The thought both honored and terrified him, knowing that his grandmother's example would be both inspiration and impossible standard to match. "The monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years because it adapts," the Queen continued, taking small sips of her soup between words. "Each generation faces challenges the previous one never imagined. Your great-grandfather dealt with World War. I dealt with the transformation of the empire into the Commonwealth. Charles will face climate change and social media, and William will face whatever comes next." She paused to look directly at Catherine, her eyes holding the warmth that had developed between them over the years. "And Catherine, you understand what it means to choose this life rather than be born into it. That perspective will be invaluable in the years ahead. The people need to see themselves reflected in their royal family, and you represent millions of women who've built their own paths while supporting their families." The dinner continued with surprisingly normal conversation about the children's schools, upcoming royal engagements, and plans for the Christmas holidays. But underneath the ordinary topics ran an undercurrent of finality, of last words being carefully chosen and memories being consciously created. Later that evening, after the formal dinner had ended and the family had dispersed to various sitting rooms and private conversations, William found himself alone with his grandmother in her study. The room was lined with books, photographs, and mementos from decades of royal service, each item holding stories and memories that would soon become historical artifacts rather than personal treasures. "I need you to promise me something," the Queen said, settling into her favorite armchair with a blanket across her knees. "Promise me that you'll remember why we do this work. It's not about the palaces or the ceremonies or the attention. It's about service to people who need stability, who need something larger than themselves to believe in during uncertain times." William nodded, understanding that this was more than advice. It was a passing of responsibility that went deeper than constitutional procedure. His grandmother was entrusting him with not just future duties, but with the preservation of values and principles that had guided the monarchy through its most challenging periods. Dawn broke gray and misty over the Scottish Highlands, the kind of weather the Queen had always said made Balmoral feel most like home. William woke early, unable to sleep through the night despite his exhaustion. He dressed quietly and made his way through the castle's familiar corridors, past portraits of ancestors who had faced their own moments of transition and loss. The kitchen staff was already preparing breakfast, moving with the quiet efficiency that marked all aspects of royal household management. Mrs. Morrison, the head cook who had been at Balmoral for nearly 30 years, looked up as William entered the warm kitchen that smelled of fresh bread and coffee. "She asked for her usual breakfast," Mrs. Morrison said softly, gesturing toward a carefully arranged tray. "Earl Grey tea, one piece of toast with marmalade, and she specifically requested that someone tell her if any of the horses seemed restless during the night." Even facing her final days, the Queen's concerns extended to every living creature under her care. William carried the tray upstairs himself, a small gesture that felt important in ways he couldn't fully articulate. The Queen was awake when he entered, sitting propped up against pillows and looking out at the gardens where early morning mist clung to the ancient oak trees. "I was wondering if you'd come," she said, accepting the tea with hands that trembled slightly but maintained their characteristic grace. "There are things I want to say while my mind is still entirely clear, while I can still find the right words for what matters most." They talked for nearly 2 hours as the mist gradually lifted from the gardens outside. The Queen shared stories William had never heard before, about her own moments of doubt during difficult periods of her reign, about the loneliness that sometimes accompanied the crown, about the small daily choices that had shaped her approach to monarchy over 7 decades. "Your father will be a good king," she said at one point, her voice growing softer as the morning progressed. "He's waited longer than anyone should have to, but that patience has given him wisdom. And you, William, you have something I never had. You chose Catherine, and she chose this life with full knowledge of what it would require. That partnership will be your greatest strength." Catherine appeared in the doorway around mid-morning, carrying fresh flowers from the garden and wearing the kind of simple dress that had become her signature. Elegant without being ostentatious, appropriate without being stuffy. She had clearly been crying, but her composure remained intact as she arranged the flowers in a vase near the window. The three of them spent the rest of the morning in quiet conversation, sometimes talking about serious matters of succession and responsibility, sometimes simply sharing memories and family stories. The Queen asked detailed questions about each of her great-grandchildren, wanting to hear about their personalities, their interests, their hopes for the future. "George has your sense of duty already," she observed to William. "But he also has Catherine's warmth with people. Charlotte has the Windsor stubbornness, which will serve her well, and Louis has that spark of mischief that keeps families human." Her ability to see the individual personalities of children she could visit only occasionally spoke to the depth of her attention to family relationships. By afternoon, other family members began gathering in the sitting room adjacent to the Queen's bedroom. Charles arrived with Camilla, both looking as though they had aged years in the past few days. Anne came with her characteristic no-nonsense attitude, barely masking deep emotion. Even Edward and Sophie made the journey from London, understanding that this might be their last opportunity to say goodbye. The atmosphere was heavy but not morbid. The Queen insisted on hearing about everyone's current projects and concerns, offering advice and expressing interest in details that showed how closely she had followed their lives despite her own declining health. She asked Anne about her upcoming charity engagements, questioned Edward about his television production work, and wanted to know if Sophie was still enjoying her patronage of organizations supporting survivors of sexual violence. As evening approached, the family began to understand that they were witnessing something remarkable. The Queen was orchestrating her own farewell, ensuring that each person felt heard and valued, that loose ends were tied up, that her final interactions with each family member carried the weight and meaning she intended. "I want you all to remember," she said as the light began to fade outside, "that being royal is not about being better than other people. It's about being useful to them, about providing service and stability when they need it most. The crown is not a prize. It's a responsibility that each generation must earn anew." The night passed with family members taking turns sitting with the Queen, each wanting to ensure she was never alone while also recognizing her need for rest. William and Catherine had returned to their room around midnight, but sleep came fitfully. They lay quietly talking about memories, about the children, about the enormous changes that lay ahead for their family and the country. Around 4 in the morning, a gentle knock came at their door. Charles stood in the hallway, still dressed. From the previous evening, his face telling them everything they needed to know without words. "She's asking for everyone," he said simply. "The doctors think it won't be long now." They dressed quickly and made their way through corridors that seemed different in the pre-dawn darkness, more solemn somehow, as if the castle itself understood the significance of what was happening within its ancient walls. The Queen's bedroom was softly lit by bedside lamps, creating an atmosphere of peace rather than medical crisis. She was conscious and alert when they entered, her eyes moving from face to face as her family gathered around her bed. Despite the circumstances, there was something almost serene about the scene. 3 generations of the royal family united in this final moment, personal grief taking precedence over protocol and procedure. "I want to tell you all how proud I am," the Queen said, her voice weaker now but still carrying that unmistakable authority. "Not proud of what you've achieved in your public roles, though that matters too. I'm proud of who you are as people, of how you've handled both success and difficulty, of the way you've supported each other even when it wasn't easy." She spoke directly to each person present, offering final words that seemed perfectly tailored to their individual personalities and circumstances. To Charles, she expressed confidence in his readiness to serve as king. To William, she emphasized the importance of his role as father and future monarch. To Catherine, she spoke about the unique position of someone who had chosen royal life and could help bridge the gap between the monarchy and modern Britain. The sun began to rise over the Scottish mountains as the Queen grew quieter, her breathing becoming more labored but her presence still commanding the room. Catherine held one of her hands while William held the other, a simple human connection that transcended titles and protocol. Around 8 in the morning, with golden light streaming through the bedroom windows and illuminating the faces of her family, the Queen closed her eyes for the final time. The moment was peaceful, surrounded by people who loved her not just as a monarch, but as a grandmother, mother, and matriarch who had shaped their lives in countless ways. The immediate aftermath was both surreal and intensely practical. Charles was now king, though the formal proclamation would wait for their return to London. William was now heir apparent, first in line to a throne that suddenly seemed much closer than it had the day before. Catherine was now married to the future King of England, a reality that brought new weight to every decision she would make going forward. But in that bedroom at Balmoral, surrounded by morning light and the quiet presence of grief, they were simply a family saying goodbye to someone they had loved and depended on for decades. The constitutional implications would come later. The state funeral planning would begin soon. The formal mourning period would follow established protocol. Right now, they had a few precious moments to be human beings experiencing loss, rather than public figures managing a constitutional transition. The Queen's longtime dresser, Angela Kelly, appeared quietly in the doorway with the black outfit that had been prepared for this moment. A simple but elegant dress that would be the Queen's final outfit, chosen with the same care and attention that had marked her approach to royal presentation throughout her reign. William found himself thinking about his children, still asleep in London, who would wake up to a world where their great-grandmother was no longer alive, where their father was now heir to the throne, where their own positions in the line of succession had moved closer to actual responsibility. The weight of explaining this change to young minds seemed almost overwhelming in that moment of fresh grief. The journey back to London felt like traveling between 2 different worlds: the private grief of family loss and the public responsibility of constitutional transition. William and Catherine sat in relative silence during the flight, both processing the magnitude of what had just occurred and what lay ahead in the coming days and weeks. The plane descended through gray clouds that seemed fitting for the somber mood of the nation below. News of the Queen's death had been announced while they were still at Balmoral, and already the machinery of state mourning had begun to turn. Flags would be flying at half-mast, official statements would be released, and millions of people would be processing their own sense of loss for a monarch who had been a constant presence in British life for over 70 years. At RAF Northolt, they were met by senior palace staff whose faces reflected the same mixture of grief and professional duty that would characterize the next several weeks. The constitutional requirements were clear and had been rehearsed many times, but the emotional reality of implementing them was something entirely different from the theoretical preparations. The drive through London revealed a city already transforming itself for mourning. Black ribbons appeared on official buildings. Television broadcasts had shifted to somber tones and content, and people gathered in small groups outside Buckingham Palace, many carrying flowers or simply standing in quiet contemplation of what the Queen's death meant for their country and their own sense of identity. Back at Kensington Palace, William and Catherine faced the immediate challenge of explaining the day's events to their children. George, at 10 years old, understood the basic facts of death and succession, but the emotional complexity of losing a beloved great-grandmother while simultaneously watching his father become heir to the throne was difficult for any child to process. Charlotte and Louis needed even more careful handling, their questions about why everyone was sad mixing with confusion about what being heir to the throne actually meant for their family's daily life. Catherine found herself drawing on reserves of patience and explanation she didn't know she possessed, trying to balance honesty about death with age-appropriate information about their changing roles in the royal family. The next few days blurred, together in a mixture of private grief and public duty. William and Catherine attended planning meetings for the state funeral, participated in the formal proclamation of Charles as king, and began the delicate process of adjusting to their new positions within the royal hierarchy. Every decision, from what they wore to public appearances to how they responded to condolences, carried additional weight now that William was heir apparent. The state funeral itself became a remarkable display of both personal emotion and constitutional continuity. Westminster Abbey filled with world leaders, representatives from across the Commonwealth, and ordinary citizens who had won places in the public ballot. The ceremony balanced grandeur with genuine feeling, tradition with personal touches that reflected the Queen's own personality and preferences. William and Catherine's composure throughout the funeral earned widespread admiration. Their ability to display appropriate grief while maintaining the dignity expected of their positions, striking exactly the right tone for a nation processing its own complex emotions about the Queen's death and the future of the monarchy. In the weeks that followed, they began to understand how profoundly their lives had changed. William's role as heir apparent brought new responsibilities and expectations, while Catherine found herself thrust into an even more prominent position as the wife of the future king. Their children's lives would now unfold under even greater scrutiny, their education and upbringing carrying implications for the future of the monarchy itself. But perhaps most significantly, they had witnessed firsthand how a life of service could be concluded with dignity and grace, how personal relationships within the royal family could provide strength during times of transition, and how the monarchy could adapt to change while maintaining its essential character and purpose. The Queen's final gift to her family had been showing them how to say goodbye with love rather than regret, how to face the future with confidence rather than fear, and how to honor the past while embracing the responsibilities that lay ahead. William and Catherine, now firmly established as the future of the monarchy, would carry forward not just the constitutional requirements of their roles, but the deeper understanding of service, duty, and family that the Queen had embodied throughout her remarkable reign. As autumn settled over Britain and the official mourning period drew to a close, they began to chart their course forward, guided by the Queen's example, but prepared to meet the challenges of their own era with the strength and unity they had discovered during those final days at Balmoral.